I never thought my life would change in a single night. Standing outside the hospital, rain pouring down like the sky was mourning something, I saw it, a small wicker basket tucked against the wall, sheltered barely by the awning. My shift had just ended. Exhaustion pulled at every muscle, tugged at every bone. 12 hours of charting and filing and pretending I didn't notice the way my fellow nurses avoided the Omega wing because the scents got too intense during full moons. But something made me stop. Something made me look. Inside that basket was a baby. Tiny fists curled against a thin blanket, eyes squeezed shut, lips trembling in the cold. His scent hit me even through the rain. Sweet milk and newborn, undercut with something sharp. Fear. Hope. The biological terror of being alone. My heart shattered right there on that wet pavement. I was 23 years old, unmated. An Omega who'd spent his entire life being told he wasn't enough, not pretty enough, not submissive enough, not worth the alpha who'd never come. I lived in a studio apartment with a leaking faucet and a landlord who smelled like stale beer and entitlement. I had no business taking in a baby, but I couldn't leave him there. Tucked beside him was a crumpled note, ink smudged but still legible. Please take care of him. That was it. No name. No explanation. Just a desperate plea from someone who couldn't hold on anymore. The handwriting was shaky, female, I thought, or maybe just someone whose hands were trembling. I picked up that basket, cradled it against my chest, against the thin cotton of my scrub top that did nothing to block the cold. The baby's scent shifted immediately, the sharp edges softening as he registered warmth, heartbeat, the faint lavender of my nesting instinct trying to kick in even though I wasn't pregnant and had never been. I've got you, I whispered, and my voice cracked on the second word. I've got you, little one. I walked back into the hospital. The social worker on call was a beta named Margaret who'd seen everything. She asked me questions, so many questions. Was I sure? Did I understand the responsibility? Did I have support? Was I bonded? Did I have an alpha? Would there be an alpha? What about my nest? What about my sins? What about my... Yes, I said to everything. Yes, 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 even when the truth was that I had nothing. No family. No safety net. No backup plan. Just me and the faint, ridiculous hope that somehow, someway, I could be enough for this tiny creature who'd been thrown away like garbage. That night, in my small apartment that suddenly felt even smaller, I held him and tried to figure out what came next. He cried sharp, piercing wails that made my chest ache in ways I didn't understand. My Omega instincts surged, confused and frantic. I didn't have milk to give him. I didn't have a bond to share. I didn't have the one thing every Omega was supposed to have, an alpha's scent to calm him, an alpha's presence to make him feel safe. So I sang instead. I don't even know what song it was, just something my mother used to hum when I was young, before she presented Beta and decided Omegas were too much trouble to raise. Before she left. Before I learned that the only person I could count on was myself. Eventually, he quieted. His breathing evening out as he fell asleep in my arms, those tiny fists uncurling against my chest. I looked down at him, the soft dark hair, the little bow mouth, the way his nose scrunched even in sleep, and felt something crack open inside me. I'm naming you Leo, I whispered. Leo Alexander. Because you're going to be strong. You're going to be brave. You're going to be everything they said we couldn't be. He didn't respond. He was 3 weeks old, maybe 4. Too young to understand anything except warmth and hunger and the vague sense of safety that came from being held. But I meant it anyway. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. Leo needed everything. Formula, diapers, clothes, medicine. When he caught a cold at 6 weeks, I spent an entire night awake watching him breathe, my phone clutched in my hand, ready to dial 911 if his little chest stopped moving. My job as a medical records clerk barely covered my own expenses, rent, utilities, the suppressants I took to keep my heats manageable so I could actually function in a world designed for betas and alphas, let alone a baby's needs. I was drowning, working overtime whenever I could, sacrificing sleep, skipping meals so he could eat. My scent went sour with stress. I could smell it myself, that bitter edge that warned other omegas to stay away and made alphas either uncomfortable or predatory. Neither reaction was helpful. Mrs. Chin, my elderly neighbor who'd taken a liking to Leo, watched me stumble home one evening and pressed a container of dumplings into my hands. "You're too thin," she said, her accent thick, her eyes sharp. "Baby needs you healthy." "I am fine," I lied. She snorted. Omega. So stubborn. But she kept watching Leo during my shifts anyway, refusing payment no matter how many times I offered. "You pay me when you can," she said. "Now go. Work. Make money for this sweet boy." Leo smiled at me for the first time when he was 10 weeks old, this tiny, gummy grin that lit up his whole face, his eyes crinkling at the corners like he knew something I didn't. I burst into tears. Happy tears for once. Tears that tasted like salt and relief and the desperate, overwhelming love I hadn't known I was capable of. He was mine. I was his. Nothing else mattered. But still, I needed more. I needed stability. Better pay. Something that could give Leo the life he deserved, not the one I was barely scraping together, not the one where I had to choose between his formula and my suppressants, not the one where I lay awake at night wondering what would happen to him if I collapsed from exhaustion. That's when I saw the job posting for Kint Industries. Kint Industries occupied an entire skyscraper in the financial district. All glass and steel, intimidating in its perfection. I felt small walking through those revolving doors, my second-hand suit suddenly feeling cheaper than it was. The lobby buzzed with employees, betas mostly, efficient and scentless, moving with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about heats or alphas or the million other things that made Omega life complicated. The receptionist directed me to the 14th floor. My hands were sweating as I rode the elevator up, trying to rehearse answers to questions I hadn't been asked yet. I'd taken extra suppressants that morning, enough to keep my scent neutral for at least 8 hours. It was risky. Too many suppressants could trigger a breakthrough heat, and that was the last thing I needed in the middle of a job interview. But I couldn't afford for them to smell me. Couldn't afford the assumptions that came with Omega applicant. Couldn't afford the way Alpha's eyes went sharp and possessive, or the way Beta's went dismissive, like I was already too much trouble to bother with. The hallway on the 14th floor was sleek, modern, with abstract art on the walls that probably cost more than my yearly rent. I was led to a conference room, leather chairs, a table so polished I could see my reflection in it, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I sat down, trying to calm my racing heart. Then the door opened, and he walked in. Dorian Kint. I'd seen his photo on the company website, the young CEO who'd taken over at 26 and doubled profits within 3 years. The rumors about him were endless, that he was a dominant alpha, that he'd never taken a mate, that his scent was so powerful even betas could smell it, that he'd once fired someone for blinking wrong during a presentation. But nothing prepared me for the reality of him. He was tall, easily over 6'4", with broad shoulders that filled out his charcoal suit perfectly. Dark hair, cut short on the sides and longer on top, with a streak of silver at the temple that couldn't possibly be natural but looked devastating anyway. His jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. His hands, his hands, were large, long-fingered, the kind of hands that could break bones or cradle something precious. But it was his eyes that stopped me cold. Gray like storm clouds. Like the sky the night I found Leo. They looked at me with an intensity that made me forget how to breathe, and I felt something primal kick in my chest. My Omega instincts screaming alpha, 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 even as my rational brain tried to shut them down. He didn't smile. Didn't offer his hand. Just walked to the head of the table, set down a folder, and sat with a kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. "Sit," he said. His voice was deep, commanding, the kind of voice that made Omegas want to bare their throats and Betas want to obey. I hated how my body responded to it. Hated the way my pulse quickened, the way my scent threatened to spike past the suppressants. I was already sitting, but I sat up straighter anyway. The interview began. He asked about my experience, my skills, why I wanted the position. I answered as best I could, trying to ignore the way his gaze occasionally flicked up to study me, like he was reading something beyond my words. He was professional, distant, completely unreadable. Then he asked about gaps in my resume. I hesitated. I've been taking care of my son. He's very young, and I needed to make sure he was settled before returning to full-time work. For the first time, his expression shifted. Just slightly. A tightening around his eyes. A pause that lasted a second too long. His nostrils flared, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. He was scenting me, trying to parse something in my biology that didn't quite add up. Your son, he repeated. His tone was flat, but there was something underneath. Something I couldn't name. Yes, Leo? He's 4 months old. Something flickered across his face. Gone so fast I might have imagined it. Pain maybe, or recognition. His scent, faint, controlled, but present, shifted. Wood smoke and winter air, with something darker underneath. Cedar. Vetiver. Alpha. I looked away before my instincts could do something stupid, like whimper. He closed the folder with a decisive snap, stood, and buttoned his jacket. You'll start Monday. Human Resources will contact you with the details. I blinked, stunned. I thank you. I won't let you down. He didn't respond. Just walked to the door. But he paused there, his hand on the handle, and glanced back at me. His eyes held something I couldn't name, pain, maybe, or recognition. It was gone in an instant, replaced by that cold, impenetrable mask. Don't be late, he said. Then he left. I sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I got the job. Relief washed over me, so intense I almost laughed. This was it, the break I needed. The chance to give Leo a better life. When I picked Leo up from Mrs. Chen's, he was fussy, reaching for me with those tiny hands. I held him close, pressing a kiss to his forehead. We're going to be okay, baby, I whispered. Everything's going to be okay now. But as I rode the bus home, Leo sleeping against my shoulder, I couldn't shake the image of Dorian Kint's eyes. That strange, haunted look when I mentioned my son. What did it mean? Why did it feel like he'd seen a ghost? I told myself I was overthinking it. He was just my boss. Nothing more. Monday would come, I'd do my job, and life would finally start making sense again. I had no idea how wrong I was. Monday morning arrived with nervous energy crackling through my veins. I woke before dawn, double-checking everything. Leo's daycare bag, my own briefcase, the address of Kint Industries written on a post-it note even though I'd memorized it. Leo was cranky, refusing his bottle, and I spent 20 minutes coaxing him to eat while simultaneously trying to get dressed. By the time I dropped him off at the daycare center, a bright, cheerful place that cost nearly half my expected salary became highly recommended. I was already running 5 minutes behind. I kissed Leo goodbye, ignoring the way my chest ached as he started crying, reaching for me as the caregiver took him. He'll be fine, she assured me with a kind smile. First day is always hard. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and rushed out. Kint Industries looked even more imposing in the morning light. The lobby was bustling with employees, everyone moving with purpose and confidence. I checked in at reception, received my badge and a packet of paperwork, and was directed to the 12th floor, executive level. My first assignment, deliver a stack of financial reports to Dorian Kint's office. Simple. Routine. Nothing to be nervous about. Yet my hands trembled as I carried the files down the corridor, each step bringing me closer to that massive door with his name on a sleek metal placard. I knocked twice, my knuckles barely making a sound against the heavy wood. Come in. His voice, that same commanding tone from the interview, sent a shiver down my spine. I pushed the door open. His office was enormous. Glass walls overlooking the city, minimalist furniture in black and chrome, everything screaming wealth and power. Dorian sat behind his desk, eyes fixed on his laptop screen, fingers moving across the keyboard with quick efficiency. He didn't look up. I approached quietly, setting the files on the corner of his desk. The financial reports you requested, Mr. Kint. Leave them, he said, still not looking at me. I turned to go, relief flooding through me. One task down, thousands more to go. Wait. I froze. Turned back slowly. He was looking at me now. Those gray eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach flip. You mentioned you have a son, he said. It wasn't a question, more like he was confirming a fact he'd been mulling over. Yes, sir. Leo. His jaw clenched. A muscle twitched near his temple. How old? 4 months. Another pause. His eyes narrowed slightly, like he was calculating something, working through a puzzle I couldn't see. You may go, he finally said, his tone dismissive. I left quickly, my heart pounding for reasons I didn't understand. Why was he asking about Leo? Why did he look at me like that? Like I was holding something that belonged to him. The rest of the day was a whirlwind. I was assigned a desk outside Dorian's office, essentially becoming his gatekeeper. I screened calls, managed his calendar, organized meetings, and tried to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. He was demanding but not cruel, expecting perfection but acknowledging good work with curt nods. Still, I noticed things. The way he'd pause when passing my desk if I had my phone out, glancing at the screen where Leo's face beamed from my lock screen. The way his expression would tighten, something dark and pained crossing his features, before he'd look away and keep walking. The way his scent would spike, just slightly, just for a moment, whenever I came back from pumping breast milk in the mother's room. I wasn't producing much, Omega men rarely did, but every drop mattered, and the act itself seemed to trigger something in him. Something he was fighting hard to suppress. 2 weeks passed. I fell into a rhythm, drop Leo off work, pick Leo up, spend the evening playing with him, fall into bed exhausted, repeat. Dorian and I developed a professional rapport, communicating mostly through emails and brief exchanges. He was always distant, always cold, but there were moments, fleeting and strange, where I'd catch him watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Then came the office party. A celebration for closing a major deal, held in the building's rooftop lounge. I hadn't planned to attend, preferring to get home to Leo, but my supervisor insisted. Just make an appearance, she said. It's good for networking. So I went, nursing a glass of sparkling water while watching colleagues dance and laugh, loosened by alcohol and success. I stood near the windows, looking out at the city lights, thinking about Leo, probably sleeping by now at Mrs. Chen's place. You're not drinking. I turned, startled, to find Dorian standing beside me, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He'd loosened his tie, the top button of his shirt undone, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. Though relaxed for Dorian, Kint still meant coiled tension, barely held in check. No, I said. I need to pick up my son soon. Can't afford to be impaired. Something shifted in his expression. Softening, maybe, or deepening into sadness. He took a sip of his drink, eyes never leaving mine. You care about him a lot. He's my son. He's everything. Dorian nodded slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He set his glass down on a nearby table, still half full. I should go, he said quietly, almost to himself. This was a mistake. Before I could ask what he meant, he walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stared after him, confused and oddly concerned. What was going on in his head? Why did talking about Leo affect him so much? The next week, Leo got sick. A fever that spiked suddenly, making him listless and unresponsive. I called the office in a panic, barely coherent, as I told him I had to leave immediately. I didn't wait for approval, just grabbed my things and ran. Dorian caught me at the elevator. What happened? He demanded, and for once there was genuine concern in his voice. Leo, he's burning up. I need to get to the hospital. He didn't try to stop me. Just nodded once, stepped back. I spent 6 hours in the emergency room. The doctor said it was just a virus, nothing serious, but they wanted to keep him overnight for observation. I stayed with him, holding his tiny hand, whispering promises that I'd always be there, that he'd always be safe with me. When I returned to work 2 days later, exhausted, emotionally drained, I found an envelope on my desk. Inside was cash, enough to cover the hospital bills and then some. A note was tucked inside, written in sharp, efficient handwriting. For your son's medical expenses. Don't argue. No signature. But I knew who it was from. I looked toward Dorian's office. Through the glass walls, I could see him at his desk, focused on his computer. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge me, but he'd help me. This cold, distant man had quietly made sure Leo was taken care of. Who was Dorian Kint, really? And why did I feel like there was so much more to him than the icy exterior he showed the world? 3 weeks passed. Dorian never mentioned the money, and I never brought it up, though the weight of his unexpected kindness lingered between us, like an unspoken secret. His behavior toward me didn't change. He remained professional, distant, efficient. But there were cracks now. Tiny fissures in his armor that I couldn't help but notice. The way he'd slow his pace when walking past my desk if I was scrolling through photos of Leo during my break. How he'd linger fractionally longer than necessary when I mentioned needing to leave early for a pediatrician appointment. The furrow between his brows when he overheard me on the phone, cooing at Leo through the speaker. It was unsettling. It made me wonder. On a Thursday afternoon, quiet and unremarkable, his assistant approached my desk with a tense expression. Mr. Kint needs to see you. No? In his office. My stomach dropped. Had I made a mistake? Filed something incorrectly? I mentally reviewed the past week's work, finding nothing that warranted this kind of urgent summons. I knocked on his door, heard his muffled enter, and stepped inside. He wasn't at his desk. Instead, he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands shoved deep in his pockets, shoulders rigid with tension. The city stretched out below us, indifferent to whatever was about to happen in this room. Close the door, he said without turning around. I did. My pulse quickened. The click of the latch sounded too loud in the silence. Sit down, he continued, still facing the windows. I lowered myself into one of the chairs facing his desk, hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. The silence stretched on, heavy, suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, the distant hum of the air conditioning. Nothing else. Finally he turned. His face was drawn, exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. There were shadows under his eyes I hadn't noticed before, a tightness around his mouth that spoke of barely contained emotion. And his scent, God, his scent. It was everywhere. Wood smoke and cedar, thick and distressed, filling the room until I could barely breathe. I need to ask you something, he said. His voice was rougher than usual. And I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course, Mr. Kint. Where did you find Leo? The question hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, confused and suddenly defensive. What do you mean? Where did you find him? He repeated, each word deliberate. You said he was your son, but you also said he's 4 months old. You've worked here for 3 weeks. I've seen your employment history. There's no record of maternity leave, no mention of a child in your previous job applications. So I'm asking you again. Where did you find him? My mouth went dry. How did he know? How could he possibly know? I adopted him, I said carefully, from outside the hospital. Someone left him there. His entire body went rigid. I watched, fascinated and terrified, as the color drained from his face. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Which hospital? Mercy General. On the east side. When? What time? April 15th. Around 11 at night. I just finished my shift. I was working as a medical records clerk back then. I swallowed hard. Why are you asking me this? What's going on? Dorian stopped directly in front of me. Close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. His eyes, God, his eyes were filled with so much pain, it physically hurt to look at them. Describe him to me, he demanded. Every detail. I don't understand. Please. The word broke on his lips, desperate, raw. Just tell me. So I did. I described Leo. Dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, his bright blue-gray eyes that seemed to see everything, the small birthmark on his left shoulder blade shaped like a crescent moon. I described how he laughed when I tickled his feet, how he hated green beans but loved sweet potatoes, how he'd started trying to crawl last week. With every word, I watched Dorian Kint fall apart. He stumbled backward, collapsing into his desk chair like his legs had given out. His hands came up to cover his face, and I heard it, a sound so broken, so anguished, it made my chest constrict. Mr. Kint, I stood uncertain whether to approach or flee. Are you all right? Should I call someone? He shook his head, lowering his hands. Tears streaked his face. Actual tears from this man who I'd never seen display anything beyond cold professionalism. He's mine, Dorian whispered, and the words shattered something fundamental in my understanding of reality. Leo is my son. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room tilted sideways, and I gripped the armrest of the chair to keep from falling. That's not possible, I managed to say, though my voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. Dorian reached for his wallet with shaking hands, pulled out a worn photograph, and held it out to me. I took it numbly. The photo showed a young woman, pretty blonde, smiling but with sadness in her eyes. She was holding a newborn baby, hospital blankets wrapped around a tiny form. But it was the baby's face that made my world stop spinning. Those eyes, that hair, the exact same features I saw every day in Leo. Her name was Elena, Dorian said, his voice hollow. We were together for 2 years. She was an omega, sweet, gentle, everything I thought I wanted. When she got pregnant, I thought. He stopped, swallowing hard. I thought we'd be a family. What happened? She couldn't handle it. The responsibility. The permanence. The way my alpha instincts kept trying to claim her, to bond with her, to make her mine in ways she wasn't ready for. His jaw clenched. She left the hospital 3 days after Leo was born. Took him with her. I tried to find them, he continued, staring at nothing. Hired investigators. Filed reports. Checked every shelter and hospital in the state. She just disappeared. 2 months later, her parents contacted me. They said Elena had given the baby up for adoption. That it was better this way. That I should move on. His hands clenched into fists again. I believed them. I thought my son was safe somewhere, with people who wanted him. I tried to move on, buried myself in work, in building the company, in anything that would keep me from thinking about the son I'd never get to know. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the full depth of his agony. But she didn't give him up for adoption, did she? She abandoned him. Left him outside a hospital like garbage. And if you hadn't found him that night, if you hadn't been there, he couldn't finish the sentence. I was crying now too. Silent tears streaming down my face. This couldn't be happening. Leo was mine. I'd raised him, cared for him, loved him. I need to see him, Dorian said, standing abruptly. I need to see my son. No. The word came out sharper than I intended. You can't just... We need to verify this first. DNA test. Legal documentation. Fine. He was already moving, pulling his phone from his pocket. I'll arrange it tomorrow. We'll go to a lab, get tested. And when it comes back positive, because it will, we'll figure out what happens next. And what has happened next? I demanded, standing to face him. You're his biological father. But I've been his parent for 4 months. I'm the one who feeds him, changes him, stays up all night when he's sick. You can't just take him from me. I'm not trying to take him from you. Dorian's voice softened, just slightly. But he's my son. I have rights. I have. His voice cracked. I have a right to know him. We stood there, staring at each other across the expanse of his office. Two people whose lives had just collided in the most impossible way. Tomorrow, I finally said, we'll do the test tomorrow. But until we have proof, until we know for certain, this conversation doesn't leave this room. He nodded, accepting the terms. I left his office on unsteady legs, retrieved my things from my desk, and somehow made it to the daycare to pick up Leo. When they handed him to me, When he smiled and reached for my face with those tiny, perfect hands, I held him so tight he squirmed in protest. "You're mine," I whispered against his soft hair, breathing in his baby scent. "You're mine, and nothing's going to change that." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. Everything had already changed. Because Dorian Kint was Leo's father. And tomorrow, the DNA test would prove it. The next morning arrived too quickly, bringing with it a reality I wasn't ready to face. I barely slept, spent most of the night watching Leo in his crib, memorizing every detail of his face, as if someone might erase him from my life. At dawn, Dorian had arranged everything. A private lab, early appointment, complete discretion. When I arrived with Leo strapped to my chest in his carrier, Dorian was already there, standing in the parking lot like a statue. He wore jeans and a plain black sweater, the most casual I'd ever seen him, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. Our eyes met across the asphalt. Neither of us smiled. Inside, the lab technician was professional and efficient, explaining the process in a gentle voice clearly meant to ease anxious parents. Except we weren't parents, not together, anyway. We were two strangers bound by a child neither of us had planned for. "This won't hurt," the technician assured us, preparing the swab. "Just a quick cheek sample from the baby and both potential parents." "I'm the parent," I said reflexively, my voice sharper than intended. "He's the biological father." Dorian flinched but said nothing. Leo was perfect during his sample collection, gurgling happily as the technician rubbed the swab along the inside of his cheek. But when she moved toward Dorian, Leo suddenly reached out, tiny fingers grasping at the air between them. Dorian froze. Then slowly, he extended his hand. Leo latched onto his finger, holding tight. And something crumbled in Dorian's expression. A wall I hadn't even known was there, suddenly gone. "He knows," Dorian whispered, his voice thick. "Somehow he knows." I wanted to argue, to say that babies grabbed at everything, that it meant nothing. But I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat. The technician completed the samples efficiently. "Results in 7 days. We'll call both numbers on file." 7 days. A week to prepare for my entire world to shift. Outside, Dorian walked us to my car. Leo had fallen asleep against my shoulder, his breath warm on my neck. Dorian watched him with naked longing, not bothering to hide it anymore. "Can I?" He started, then stopped. "Would you let me hold him?" Just for a moment. Every instinct screamed no. But I looked at Dorian's face, saw the desperation there, the grief of a father who'd lost time he could never reclaim, and found myself nodding. I transferred Leo carefully into his arms. Dorian cradled him like he was made of glass, staring down at the sleeping baby with an expression of such profound love and sorrow that I had to look away. "I missed everything," he said quietly. His birth, his first smile, the first time he laughed. "I missed all of it because she..." His voice broke. "Because she threw him away like he was nothing." "He was never nothing," I said fiercely. "From the moment I found him, he's been everything." Dorian looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw gratitude mixed with something else. Respect, maybe. Or recognition. "You saved him," he said simply. "You gave him the love I should have been there to give." He handed Leo back reluctantly, his hands lingering on the blanket before letting go completely. The following week was torture. Dorian gave me paid leave without my asking, understanding somehow that I needed space. I spent the days in a fog, going through the motions of caring for Leo while my mind spun in endless circles. What if the test was positive? What if Dorian decided he wanted full custody? What if I lost Leo? That last thought was unbearable. I'd lie awake at night holding Leo close, whispering promises I had no power to keep. And then there was the other thing. The thing I didn't want to think about but couldn't ignore. My heat was coming. I could feel it building, the slow, inevitable pressure in my lower belly, the way my scent was getting stronger despite the suppressants, the way everything smelled sharper, more intense. I'd been pushing it off for weeks, taking higher doses than I should have, but my body was done waiting. An omega in heat without an alpha was miserable. An omega in heat while caring for a baby was dangerous. I needed to figure something out. Fast. But first, I needed to know. Day 7 arrived with cruel punctuality. My phone rang at 9 o'clock in the morning, the lab's number on the screen. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The results are ready, the technician said. You can pick them up anytime, or we can email them to you. Email, I managed. Please. I hung up and stared at my inbox, refreshing compulsively until a message appeared. The subject line was, Clinical DNA Paternity Test Results. I couldn't open it. My finger hovered over the screen, but I couldn't make myself tap. My phone rang again. Dorian. Did you get the email? His voice was steady, but I heard the tremor underneath. Yes. Have you opened it? No. A pause. Have you? No. I thought, maybe we should be together when we find out. Why? We already know what it's going to say. Do we? He exhaled slowly. Meet me at my office. 1 hour. We'll open it together. He hung up before I could refuse. I dropped Leo at Mrs. Chen's. She asked no questions, just gave me a knowing hug, and drove to Kint Industries. The elevator ride up felt like ascending to a guillotine. Dorian's office door was open. He stood by the windows again, that same posture of controlled despair I was beginning to recognize as his default. I'm here, I announced unnecessarily. He turned. His eyes were red-rimmed, shadows beneath them darker than before. My phone's on the desk. Pull up the email. I did, my hand steadier than I expected. The phone was unlocked, the email already on screen. On 3, Dorian said, coming to stand beside me. 1, 2, 3. I tapped. The document opened. Pages of technical jargon, genetic markers, probability percentages. But only one line mattered. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. The tested male is the biological father of the tested child. The world tilted. I gripped the edge of the desk, fighting the sudden urge to vomit. He's mine, Dorian breathed, and there was wonder in his voice alongside the pain. Leo is my son. I couldn't respond. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. What happens now? I finally managed, hating how small my voice sounded. Dorian turned to face me fully. That depends on you. I'm me. You're his father. You have legal rights. You could. I could what? Take him from the only parent he's ever known. Destroy the life you've built for him. He shook his head firmly. I'm not doing that. I'm not Elena. I won't hurt my son to satisfy my own needs. Then what do you want? To be part of his life. To know him. To be his father, not just the man whose DNA he shares. His voice cracked. But only if you'll allow it. Only if we can find a way to do this together. I stared at him, searching for manipulation or hidden agendas. I found only sincerity. We need rules, I said slowly. Boundaries. A schedule. Whatever you need. And legally, we need to formalize custody arrangements. Protect everyone involved. My lawyers can draft something. Fair to both of us. With Leo's best interests as the priority. I nodded, my mind racing. You can visit on weekends. Saturdays for now. We'll see how Leo adjusts. Thank you. The gratitude in his voice nearly broke me. But there was something else I needed to tell him. Something I'd been dreading. There's one more thing, I said, my cheeks flushing. My heat. It's coming. Probably within the next week or two. Dorian's expression didn't change, but his scent spiked, wood smoke and cedar, sharp and intense. I watched him fight to control it, his jaw clenching, his hands curling into fists at his sides. How long have you been suppressing? Too long. I've been taking higher doses than recommended. My body's. It's done waiting. Have you made arrangements? I was going to hire a beta caretaker. Someone to help with Leo while I'm incapacitated. Dorian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Let me help." I stared at him. "What?" "Let me help with your heat." "Not as an alpha," he added quickly, seeing my expression. "Not like that. But I have resources. Medical support. A safe environment where you can ride it out without worrying about Leo or your safety. You want me to spin my heat in your penthouse? I want you to be safe." His gray eyes held mine. "Omegas die in heats, Noah. They die because they're alone, because they don't have support, because they're too ashamed to ask for help. I won't let that happen to you. Not when you're the only parent my son has." The words hit me somewhere deep, somewhere I'd been trying to ignore. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay." That first Saturday, Dorian arrived at my apartment at 10 sharp, holding a bag of age-appropriate toys he'd clearly researched extensively. Leo took one look at him and smiled, that gummy, whole-face smile that melted hearts. Dorian sat on my living room floor and played with his son for 3 hours. He made silly faces, played peekaboo until Leo giggled himself into hiccups, helped him stack blocks just to knock them down again. And I watched, my heart simultaneously swelling and shattering as the reality settled in. Leo wasn't just mine anymore. He had a father who loved him, who wanted him, who'd move heaven and earth to be in his life. Week after week, the pattern continued. Each Saturday bringing Dorian to my door, each visit extending just a little longer than the last. What started as supervised 3-hour blocks evolved into full days, then overnight stays at Dorian's penthouse, an apartment he frantically child-proofed with the dedication of a man on a mission. Leo flourished under the attention. At 6 months old, he was pulling himself up on furniture, babbling in complex sound patterns that Dorian insisted were definitely words, and lighting up every time either of us entered the room. But it was Dorian's transformation that stunned me most. The cold, unreachable CEO I'd first met had been replaced by someone warmer, more open. He'd laugh, actually laugh deep and genuine, when Leo did something particularly adorable. He'd call me in the middle of the workday to report on new developments. He clapped his hands 3 times in a row. I swear he said, "Deh this morning." The lines between co-parents and something more were blurring, and I was terrified of what that meant. It hit me on a Wednesday. I was at work, sitting at my desk outside Dorian's office, when the first wave crashed over me. Heat, literal, burning heat, flooded through my body, and my scent exploded out of me like a bomb. Sweet omega, honey and vanilla, and something darker underneath. Need. One. Alpha. People in the hallway stopped, turned, stared. I grabbed my bag and ran. Dorian caught me at the elevator, the same elevator where he caught me weeks ago when Leo was sick. But this time, he didn't just let me go. No. His voice was sharp, commanding. His eyes had gone dark, pupils blown wide. I could smell him, wood smoke and cedar, thick and overwhelming, his alpha instincts responding to my omega distress whether he wanted them to or not. "I have to go," I gasped, clutching the wall. "I have to, I can't be here. You're not leaving like this." He grabbed my arm, gently, so gently, even though every instinct must have been screaming at him to do otherwise. "You can barely stand. You'll collapse before you get to the parking garage. I don't have a choice. You do." He pulled out his phone, typed something with one hand while keeping the other on my arm. "I'm calling my driver. We're going to my penthouse. I have a medical team on standby. You're going to be safe. Leo. Mrs. Chen is watching him until 6, right? I'll have someone pick him up and bring him to the penthouse. He has a nursery there now. He'll be fine." I wanted to argue. I wanted to push him away and run and hide somewhere dark and quiet until this was over. But another wave hit, and my knees buckled. Dorian caught me, lifted me like I weighed nothing. His scent wrapped around me, alpha safe, mine, and I buried my face in his chest before I could stop myself. "Shoo," he murmured against my hair. "I've got you. You're safe. I've got you." The penthouse was overwhelming. Dorian carried me through the door and into a bedroom I'd never seen before. His bedroom, I realized. The sheets were dark, the furniture minimal, the windows floor to ceiling with a view of the city. But someone had been busy. Pillows and blankets were everywhere, piled on the bed and spilling onto the floor, arranged in the rough shape of an omega's nest. One of the medical teams suggested it, Dorian said, setting me down on the edge of the bed. She said omegas in heat need a safe space. A nest. I didn't know what else to do. I looked around, tears pricking my eyes. It wasn't perfect. The blankets were the wrong texture. The pillows were too firm. The scents were all wrong, but he tried. This cold, distant alpha had tried to build me a nest. Thank you, I whispered. I'll leave you now. The medical team is just outside. Beta females, all of them. They'll bring you suppressants, fluids, anything you need. I'll be in my office down the hall if... He stopped, jaw clenching. If you need anything else. He turned to go. Wait. He froze. Dorian, I don't want to do this alone. The words hung in the air between us. I could see him fighting his alpha instincts, fighting the need to claim and protect and possess, fighting everything he'd been taught about what was appropriate between an unmated alpha and omega. No, I'm not asking you to bond with me, I said quickly. I'm not asking for that. But I'm scared, and your scent helps, and I looked down at my hands. I just don't want to be alone. Dorian stood there for a long moment. Then, slowly, he walked to the other side of the bed and sat down, keeping distance between us, keeping control. I'll stay, he said quietly, as long as you need. The heat hit again, harder this time, stealing my breath and my thoughts. I curled into the nest, pulling blankets around myself, and tried to remember how to breathe. Dorian didn't touch me, didn't move closer. But he talked to me, low and steady, his voice a lifeline in the storm. He told me about his childhood, about his father, who'd been a dominant alpha and a terrible parent, about his mother, an omega who died when he was 12, leaving behind nothing but a scent he could still remember on bad days, about the years he'd spent building Kint Industries from nothing, convinced that if he just worked hard enough, achieved enough, he could fill the emptiness inside him. He told me about Elena, about how he'd loved her or thought he had, until she got pregnant and everything fell apart. About how his alpha instincts had kicked into overdrive, territorial and possessive, scaring her even though he tried so hard to control them. About how he'd watched her walk away with her son and hadn't been able to follow because the hospital had rules and she had rights and he had nothing but a broken heart. I thought about him every day, he said, his voice cracking. Every single day, wondering if he was okay, if he was happy, if he knew somehow that his father loved him even though he'd never met him. The heat waves came and went. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. Dorian's scent wrapped around me, steady and strong, and somewhere in the haze I realized I was crying. I don't want to lose him, I sobbed. I don't want to lose Leo. He's all I have. You won't lose him. Dorian's voice was fierce. I swear to you, Noah, on everything I am, you will never lose that boy. But you're his father. You have rights. My rights don't erase yours. He leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes burning. You're his parent. You raised him. You loved him when no one else would. That matters. You matter. Another wave hit, and I couldn't hold back anymore. I crawled across the bed, across the distance I've been trying to maintain, and buried my face in his chest. Dorian went rigid. Every muscle in his body tensed. No, please, I whispered against his shirt. Please just hold me. I need. I didn't know what I needed. But Dorian seemed to. His arms came around me slowly, carefully, like he was holding something precious. His scent intensified, protective, alpha, but not demanding, not taking. Just there. Breathe, he murmured. Just breathe. I've got you. Breathe. And somehow, impossibly, the heat eased. I woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was. Then I felt it, warm, solid, and steady, wrapped around me. An arm across my waist. A chest against my back. breath stirring the hair on the top of my head. Dorian. He was still asleep. His face, in sleep, looked younger, softer. The permanent tension was gone from his jaw, the shadows from under his eyes. His scent was calm, content, like wood smoke after a fire had been safely contained. We'd slept tangled together. I didn't remember making that choice. The heat had taken most of my higher brain functions offline, but I didn't regret it either. For the first time in ever, maybe I felt safe. Then I heard it. Baby's cry. Leo? I was out of bed before my brain caught up, stumbling toward the sound. Dorian woke with a start, scrambling after me. He's in the nursery, Dorian said, his voice rough with sleep. Down the hall. I'll show you. I was already running. The nursery was beautiful. Soft colors, warm lighting, a crib that cost more than my first car. Leo stood at the railing, tears streaming down his chubby cheeks, reaching for me with desperate little hands. Mama, he sobbed, his first real word, the one he'd been practicing for weeks. Mama, mama, mama. I scooped him up, holding him so tight he squeaked. His little hands grabbed fistfuls of my hair, my shirt, anything he could reach, and he buried his face in my neck and scented me, rubbing his cheeks against my skin, marking me as isn't the only way a baby knew how. I'm here, I whispered, crying now too. I'm here, baby. Mama's here. Dorian stood in the doorway, watching us. His eyes were bright, suspiciously bright, and his scent was so thick with emotion I could barely breathe through it. He called you Mama, Dorian said quietly. He's been practicing. I kissed Leo's forehead, his cheeks, his nose. Haven't you, sweet boy? Mama's favorite word. Leo pulled back just enough to look at me, his blue-gray eyes. Dorian's eyes, I realized, searching my face. Then he smiled. That gummy, whole-face smile that had been my salvation since the first night I held him. Dada, he said, and pointed at Dorian. Dorian made a sound, something between a laugh and a sob, and crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't try to take Leo from me. Just stood close enough that Leo could reach out and grab his finger, close enough that I could smell the cedar and wood smoke of his relief. Hey, buddy, Dorian whispered, his voice cracking. Hey, Leo. I'm your dad. Leo gurgled happily, completely unaware that his entire world had just shifted. The days that followed settled into something resembling normal. Dorian and I fell into a routine, a careful, cautious dance of co-parenting and proximity. He came over every evening after work, spending a few hours with Leo before heading back to his penthouse. On weekends, we alternated locations. Leo adapted faster than either of us, thriving under the attention of 2 parents instead of 1. But the heat had changed something between us. We didn't talk about it, not directly. But there was awareness now, an undercurrent. The way Dorian's eyes tracked me across the room. The way my pulse quickened when he stood too close. The way our scents mingled in Leo's nursery, Alpha and Omega, creating something that smelled suspiciously like home. You should move in. The words came out of nowhere on a Tuesday evening when Dorian was helping Leo practice standing. I nearly dropped the bottle I was washing. What? Move in. He didn't look up from Leo, who was gripping his fingers and wobbling on unsteady legs. This apartment is too small. The commute is inefficient. And Leo deserves a space where both his parents are present. Are you asking me to live with you because it's efficient? Now he looked up. Those gray eyes, Leo's eyes, studied my face with an intensity that made my stomach flip. I'm asking you to live with me because I don't want to go home to an empty penthouse anymore. His voice was quiet, honest in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. Because when I'm here with you and Leo, I feel like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be. I set down the bottle, dried my hands, took a breath. Dorian, what are we doing? I don't know. He stood, lifting Leo onto his hip. The baby immediately grabbed a fistful of his shirt and tried to eat it. But I know I don't want to stop. We barely know each other. I know you're a good parent. I know you're kind. I know you're stubborn and brave, and you never should have had to do any of this alone. He stepped closer. I know your scent makes me feel calm for the first time in my life. I know I wake up thinking about you. I know I go to sleep thinking about you. I know. Okay. I interrupted because if he kept talking, I was going to cry. Okay. We'll try. Dorian's expression shifted. Relief, hope, something softer I couldn't name. Yeah. But we're getting a place with a yard. Leo needs space to run. He smiled. Actually smiled, full and genuine, and I felt something click into place in my chest. Whatever you want, he said. Anything. Moving in together was surprisingly easy. Dorian sold his penthouse. Too sleek, too cold, he said, and bought a house in the suburbs. A real house with 4 bedrooms and a backyard and a swing set he installed himself, cursing the entire time. I laughed so hard I cried watching him try to read the instructions. Leo took to the new space immediately, crawling through every room, pulling himself up on every piece of furniture. His first birthday was a month after we moved in, and Dorian went all out, balloons, cake, bouncy castle that took up the entire backyard. Isn't this too much? I asked, watching Leo destroy his smashed cake with reckless abandon. He only turns one once. Dorian's arm was around my waist, casual and possessive in a way that made my omega purr. Besides, I have 12 missed birthdays to make up for. I leaned into him, letting myself enjoy the moment. The domesticity of it. The rightness. But there were still things we hadn't talked about. Like the fact that we still weren't bonded. Like the fact that my next heat was coming, soon probably, and we'd both been avoiding the conversation. Like the fact that I was falling in love with him. It happened on a Thursday. Rain pouring outside, thunder rattling the windows. Leo was asleep in his crib, worn out from a day of playing, and Dorian and I were curled up on the couch watching some movie neither of us was paying attention to. I felt it coming, the heat. Not the full wave yet, but the warning signs. The warmth in my belly. The way my scent was getting stronger, sweeter, despite the suppressants. Dorian noticed, too. I could tell by the way his arm tightened around me, the way his breathing changed. No, I know. How long do we have? A day, maybe 2. I made arrangements. There's a beta caretaker on standby. I can go to a facility. No. I turned to look at him. His gray eyes were dark and tense, filled with something I was afraid to name. Dorian, stay. His voice was rough, barely controlled. Stay here. With me. Let me... He stopped, jaw clenching. Let me take care of you. You know what that means. Yes. We're not bonded. I know. If we do this, if we spend my heat together, it's going to change things. You're an alpha. I'm an omega. Biology is going to do what biology does. Dorian was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out, cupped my face in his hands, and pressed his forehead against mine. I've been fighting this since the day I met you, he whispered. Fighting the instinct to claim you, to bond with you, to make you mine. Because I thought I didn't deserve you. Because I thought you'd never want an alpha like me. Dorian. But I'm done fighting. His thumbs traced my cheekbones, gentle and reverent. I love you, Noah. I love you, and I want to spend this heat with you, and I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life. If you'll let me. The words hit me like a wave, stronger than any heat, more overwhelming than any instinct. I love you too, I breathed. God, I love you too. He kissed me. And for the first time in my life, I let myself fall. The heat hit full force an hour later. But this time, I wasn't alone. Dorian carried me to our bedroom, the one we'd been sharing for weeks without acknowledging what it meant, and lay me down on the nest we'd built together. Pillows and blankets, and the mingled sense of alpha and omega, home and safe in mine. I've got you, he murmured against my throat. I've got you, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere. His hands were everywhere, gentle, reverent, worshipful. He touched me like I was something precious, something worth protecting. And when he finally claimed me, when I felt his teeth sink into the soft skin of my throat, when I felt the bond snap into place like the final piece of a puzzle, I screamed. Not from pain. From rightness. Mine, his alpha instincts roared through the bond. Yours, my omega answered. Always. Afterward, we lay tangled together, sweaty and breathless and complete. Dorian's arms were wrapped around me, his face buried in my hair, his scent so thick with contentment I could taste it. I should have done this months ago, he mumbled. I would have said no months ago. He laughed, soft, rumbling, genuine. Yeah, you probably would have. I turned in his arms, pressing a kiss to his jaw. I love you. I love you too. His eyes met mine, gray and soft and full of wonder. I love you, and I love our son, and I'm never letting either of you go. Promise. On everything I am. 3 months into our relationship, though we told no one yet, keeping things quiet until we were certain, life had settled into something remarkable. Dorian split his time between the office and home, Leo adjusting seamlessly to having both his parents present and invested. We were talking about getting officially mated. About a ceremony small and private. About maybe someday giving Leo a sibling. Then Elena came back. I was at home, Leo playing in the backyard, me watching from the window, when the doorbell rang. The woman on my doorstep was beautiful. Blonde, thin, dressed in expensive clothes that didn't quite hide the shadows under her eyes. I recognized her from the photograph Dorian had shown me. Elena. You must be Noah, she said. Her voice was soft, tentative. I know who you are. Can I come in? Please? I just want to talk. Every instinct screamed no. But she was Leo's biological mother, and running away from hard conversations wasn't something I did anymore. 5 minutes. I led her to the living room, positioning myself so I could see Leo through the window. He was chasing a butterfly, laughing at nothing, completely oblivious. He's beautiful, Elena whispered, following my gaze. He looks just like Dorian. He looks like himself. She flinched. I deserve that. Why are you here, Elena? She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking much younger than her years. I've been in rehab. I was dealing with postpartum depression, and I started using, and everything spiraled. My parents sent me away to get help. I just got out last week, and the first thing you did was come here? The first thing I did was try to find Leo. The adoption agency told me there was no record, so I went to the hospital. They wouldn't tell me anything except that someone had found him. She swallowed hard. Then I remembered Dorian was in this city, and I thought, you thought what? That you could walk back into his life like nothing happened. I'm his mother. No. The word came out sharper than I intended. You were his biological mother for 9 months. You gave birth to him. But you're not his parent. You didn't earn that title. Elena's face crumpled. I made a mistake. You left him outside a hospital in the rain. My voice was shaking now. Rage and grief tangled together. You didn't even leave him inside, where someone would definitely find him. You left him outside, where he could have died. I know. Tears streamed down her face. I know I'm a terrible person. But I want to make it right. I want to see my son. The back door opened. Leo came running in, butterfly forgotten, his arms stretched out toward me. Mama. Mama up. I scooped him up, holding him close. He wrapped his little arms around my neck and pressed a sloppy kiss to my cheek, completely unaware of the woman watching him with desperate, tear-filled eyes. Leo, Elena breathed. My baby. No. I stepped back, putting distance between us. Your baby is the one you abandoned. This is my son. Mine and Dorian's. The front door opened. Dorian stood there, his face carved from stone, his eyes fixed on Elena. Get out. Dorian, please. I said get out. His voice was deadly quiet, his alpha instincts rising like a storm. You don't get to come here. You don't get to see him. You lost that right when you threw him away. I'm his mother. You were his incubator. Dorian crossed the room, positioning himself between Elena and Leo. I have legal documents proving abandonment. I have witnesses. I have a team of lawyers who would be thrilled to destroy you in court. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave. You're going to stay away. And if you ever come near my family again, I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your life." Elena stared at him for a long moment. Then her shoulders slumped and she nodded. Can I at least see a picture? See how he's grown?" I pulled out my phone, found a recent photo of Leo laughing in the park, and held it up without offering to let her take the phone. She looked at it for a long time, fresh tears spilling over. "He looks happy." "He is." Dorian's arm came around my waist, pulling us close. "And he's going to stay that way. Without you." Elena nodded again, backing toward the door. "I'm sorry. For everything. I hope he has a wonderful life." Then she was gone. That night, after Leo was asleep in his crib, Dorian and I stood on the back porch, looking out at the yard where our son had spent the afternoon chasing butterflies. "You think she'll really stay away?" I asked. "I think she'll try." Dorian's arm was around my shoulders, pulling me close. "But we'll deal with it together if she doesn't. All of us. As a family." Family. The word settled over me like a blessing. Leo had brought us together in the most impossible way. A child abandoned and found, a father searching for his son, an Omega who chose love over convenience. But from that chaos, we built something beautiful. A home, a family, a future. And this, I thought, as Dorian pressed a kiss to my temple and Leo's soft breathing came through the baby monitor. This was only the beginning. Epilogue. 1 year later. The ceremony was small, just us and Leo and Mrs. Chen and a few friends from work. Dorian wore a gray suit that matched his eyes. I wore white because tradition mattered and because I wanted to see the look on his face when I walked down the aisle. Leo was the ring bearer. He was supposed to walk, but he decided halfway through that crawling was faster, and everyone laughed as he made his way to the altar with the rings clutched in his tiny fist. Dorian was crying when I reached him. Not weeping. Dorian Kint didn't weep, but his eyes were bright, and his scent was so thick with emotion I could barely breathe through it. "You're beautiful," he whispered. "So are you." We said our vows. Promised to love each other, to protect each other, to build a life together. Promised to always put Leo first, to always choose each other, to never let fear or doubt or the ghosts of the past tear us apart. And when Dorian kissed me, when our bond flared bright and warm and right, I felt something click into place. This was where I belonged. In his arms. In our home. In the family we built from nothing but hope and stubbornness, and a baby left alone in the rain. "I love you," I whispered against his lips. "I love you too," he whispered back. "Both of you. Always." Leo tugged on my pant leg, demanding to be picked up. I scooped him into my arms, and Dorian wrapped his around both of us, and we stood there, Alpha and Omega and Sun, bonded and claimed and whole. The rain that had started everything was a distant memory. But sometimes on quiet nights, I still thought about it. About the woman who'd left her baby outside a hospital, about the choices that had brought us all together, about the impossible luck of being in the right place at the right time. Leo was ours now. Truly, legally, completely ours. Elena had signed away her rights after Dorian's lawyers had presented her with the evidence of abandonment. She hadn't even tried to fight. And every night, when I tucked Leo into bed and kissed his forehead and told him I loved him, I thanked whatever force in the universe had made me stop at that hospital entrance. Because that baby in the rain had given me everything. A son, a mate, a family. A reason to believe that even Omegas like me, unmated, unwanted, alone, could find their happily ever after. Then was just the beginning. And I couldn't wait to see what came next.